Good morning, students. Today we are going to start with a new poem, The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy. I think you already have some information about our poet, Thomas Hardy. He's a Victorian poet, but sometimes we refer to him also as a modern. So he lived actually in a time in between two literary ages. That's why sometimes he's called a semi-modern poet. He's Victorian and he's modern at the same time. Thomas Hardy was, or actually we know him as a famous novelist, but also he has very good attempts in poetry, and our poem is going to be one example of that. Thomas Hardy, what do we need to know about, let's say, his poetry before we start the poem? Hardy's poetry, a lot of Hardy's poetry is relatively simple and yet skillful. What does that mean? It means that actually in terms of language, you will see that although he is using a simple style in his writing, in his poetry, yet there are certain parts, certain expressions, words or phrases which show that Hardy was actually very skillful in using words. Hardy is known sometimes of his ability to coin new words, or sometimes even to create a word by joining two different words. He combined words together and he create new expressions. That's why sometimes when you read his poetry, you feel that there are certain words or expressions that you can't easily find in the dictionary. Some of his poetic writing can be difficult due to old-fashioned, so sometimes even old-fashioned words that let's say are not used anymore by writers and poets. The second let's say point here, Hardy's poems tend to be descriptive, lyrical, and regular in form. He does not tend to experiment with form. So our poem, we are going to notice these things. You're going to notice that there is a strict form, that the poem follows a certain rhyme scheme, a certain style. It describes, there is a lot of descriptions of the place, let's say, of things. The third point, let's say, that I want you to pay attention to is also related to the form, which is called enjambment. What does we mean? What does this term mean? It means that in poetry, sometimes you notice that the poet does not end the line with a punctuation mark, a period or a comma, for example. Instead of that, we don't have any a punctuation mark, which means what? It means that still the sentence is not over. We have to go to the next line in order to see what is the idea or how the idea in the sentence is going to be completed. And of course this term, or let's say this technique, which is used by poets, and I think maybe you have noticed that other poets we studied also use this technique. This is actually in order to make the reader attracted to a certain thought or idea. The poet is trying not to cut the stream of thoughts or ideas that he is talking about. And we are going to see that with Hardy. We have this technique, and it has a really significant role in the ideas or the thoughts in the poem. So let's start our poem, The Darkling Thrush. I guess from the questions that I've given you, and I'm glad that you have answered, most of you answered the questions I asked you about the bird, thrush. The thrush is a kind of bird which has a significant song, or maybe when it sings, it has a significant sound. The word darkling, let's say here, the darkling, it means darkness. It doesn't mean that the thrush's color is dark. No, it means that the thrush is standing in a dark place. See, this is what it means. So when we start, let's see our poem here. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey. So our speaker is standing in a landscape. Maybe he was walking in some kind of natural landscape. Coppice gate means a kind of gate which is made of plants, of wooden plants. So our speaker was standing in this spot, and he's going to describe for us what he sees in front of him. When frost, and notice here frost is written with capital letter. You are going to see a lot of words in this poem which are written in capital letter. Of course, there is a meaning for that. Frost, what is a frost? Frost is a kind of ice that tends to fall on the ground or on plants, especially the plants which are very low or small. And when it lands on them, what happens to them? They are being killed or damaged, and they can't grow again. So, as if here the frost is a symbol of something, which is here what? Death. Because it damages plants and prevents them from growing, it symbolizes death itself. Death as a permanent, irreversible loss. Because you know, when things die, you cannot get them back again to life. Death means the end, the loss of something forever. Of course, we know in nature we don't have such a thing. In nature, life and death are cycle. We have after death in winter, we have life in spring. But our speaker here seems so desperate that when he uses frost here in such a way, describing its dominance over the landscape, as if he is really desperate and doesn't think that after this death is that any life is coming back. And winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. So what time of the year it is? It is winter. It is in winter. We are talking about a time in the year in which nature is almost dead. Everything around seems to be motionless. Everything around gives this feeling of maybe sometimes even sickness, melancholy, depression, you know, all these negative feelings. So the winter atmosphere usually is cloudy. It is filled with fog sometimes. So when you look at the sky, it is sometimes it is really difficult to see the sun. But here, when he said the weakening eye of day, so what is the eye of the day? Of course, the day doesn't have an eye. This is a personification and metaphor at the same time. The eye of the day is the sun. And when he said weakening, it means that it is the sunset. So what time is it? And you remember in the questions, I asked you about the setting, the time and place. So the place here is a natural landscape in winter, as you have provided in your answers. And the time is specifically not only in winter, but also in the beginning of the evening time. The tangled vine stems score the sky. So what do we expect to see in winter? Usually we have these kind of plants or stems which are bare. In autumn, you know that all the leaves of the trees, they fall. So what are we left with? We are left with stems which are leafless, and when you look at them, you can see the sky through them. If they were filled with leaves, you cannot see the sky. But here it means that the landscape that the poet is describing is really abandoned. It is lifeless. The tangled vine stems score the sky like strings of broken lyres. Here the poet is trying to compare two images here. When he's saying that when you look at these vine stems, these bare stems that don't have any leaves on them, as if you are looking at strings of broken lyre. Lyre, you know, this musical instrument which has strings, and when they are broken, the because they are stretched strongly. When you broke them, what happens? They become something like the stems of trees. And you see lyre usually in poetry, when you see a poet using lyre signifies, let's say, music and poetry itself, the ability to write or to compose poetry. And all mankind, let's see, what about people? Are there any people around in this place? And all mankind that haunted, notice the use of this word haunted. You usually use this word with ghosts, not with human beings, but here as if our speaker or our poet is trying to show that mankind or people around, they are not actually, or they are not really alive. They are like ghosts. They are not living inside these houses. They are as if these houses are haunted by people. You see, it seems that even our even the people in this in the landscape seems to be also almost like dead people, not alive. Where are the people? Usually in winter, what is the place that we expect to find people in? They are in their household, beside fire, because the weather is very cold. They are sitting beside the fireplace. So you see, the landscape is desolate. It provokes despair. The prevailing mood is thus one of decline and decay, without the possibility of renewal or resurrection. This is the general atmosphere that we are trying to understand from this first stanza. So our speaker from the very beginning is not really optimistic. He's very, very desperate and pessimistic. Now in this stanza, the land's sharp features seem to be the century's corpse outlined. What features? The features he means here, all the things that he described in the first stanza. For the poet, when he looks at these sharp, harsh, dead, motionless, still features in this landscape, he feels, or it comes to him that as if he's looking at the corpse of the century. Which century? You remember in the questions I asked you when the poem was written. And this question, why is it important? Because the poet wrote and published this poem by the end of the century, and specifically the end of the 19th century and it was the beginning of the 20th. So you see, here the poet is describing the century as if it is a person, and you see, notice here it is written, the century is written with capital letter, so as if the poet is personifying century. And the century has a corpse. Why it has a corpse? Because it is ending. When it is ending, when you know death is a kind of an end to man or to human beings' life. So here, as if the century is being a human being, and when it is over, it has a corpse, a dead body, just like human beings. Where is it buried? Usually corpses are buried somewhere. So here the metaphor of the corpse is continued here in this line. He said, here's a crypt. Crypt is a place where, you see, crypt is a place where bodies are buried. So what is the place of burial for this corpse of the century? It is the cloudy canopy. It is the sky, the cloudy sky. The wind his death laments. So the wind, when you listen to the sound of the wind, it makes you think or imagine that the wind is a crying. It is the sound of crying over the dead century. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry. So one might ask, is it really that everything is hopeless and desperate and gloomy, just like the poet is describing? Isn't there any sign of life? You know, scientifically speaking, we know that in winter, nature is not absolutely or completely dead. Of course, there are signs of life. Where are these signs of life? These signs of life are found in the seeds of plants, which are buried underground, which wait to be nurtured so that they grow in spring. When the time of when spring comes, it is the time for blossoming. Things come back to life. So this germ here means the seeds, the small seeds of plants. So although this germ represents birth, and it should be some sign of hope, even that, for the poet, doesn't give him any kind of happiness or hope. Look at this one here. Hardy has made his mood an emblem for all life upon earth, and he even suggests that the very life force is shrunken hard and dry, that life itself is near to exhaustion and death. So nothing at all gives any kind or any sign of optimism or hope, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. The poet assumed that everything on earth is hopeless and sad, just like him. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs of trees. So there is this creature, and of course it is a bird. So what makes the poet so attentive to this voice? Because when he listened to the voice, he described it. Look at this line: in a full-hearted even song of joy illimited. When he listens to this voice which attracted his attention, he feels that the voice is coming out of a creature which is singing happily. It expresses joy and happiness. Even song is service of evening prayer. So here you see happiness or joy is associated with let's say with virtue and religion. So what is the attitude of the poet here? Actually, he is not able to understand why is this creature singing happily like this. And when he looked to see what is this creature, he saw. So what is this creature? It is an aged thrush. Look at the description of the bird. It is a frail, which means weak, gaunt, skinny, and small in size. And when you look at the plume is the feather of the bird. When you look at it, it seems that it was maybe in a, let's say, in a spot which is very windy. So why do you think that the description of the thrush here is important? Because if you notice, the poet did not describe the bird with anything positive. It is weak, it is skinny, and it is small. So what could you expect from such a creature which has all these, let's say, characteristics? The poet is here really astonished. How could such a creature produce such a very happy, joyful song when everything around suggests the opposite? Everything around in the landscape suggests sadness, depression, death. You see all these things. So here, although the bird is weak, thin, and old, its song has survived the strong winter winds. So here, the description here is really significant because it shows how the bird is really showing strength in the middle of all this death. It represents some kind of hope and life in the middle of all this gloomy landscape. Had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. Had chosen. Notice here the word chosen. Normally birds and animals don't have the ability to choose. This is a human equality. You can't say for animals or birds that they choose or they can't choose. They don't have this capacity. This is a human. So here the poet is personifying the bird, because he thinks that the bird has something really significant when it is singing like this. So this bird has chosen to sing and to fill the place with its, let's say, its happiness, although everything around is increasingly becoming gloomy and sad. So here, let's see. So little cause for carolings. For the poet, actually, there is no reason at all for singing. Everything around suggests that you have to be very silent, very reflective, very sad. Why would a bird or any creature would like to sing in such ecstatic sound? You see, of such ecstatic sounds. And you remember the enjambment that we were talking about in the beginning, the technique I said that Hardy is using. Notice here, for example, this one, so little cause for carolings. Here we don't have any punctuation mark here in the end of the line. Why we don't have one? Because the sentence is not over yet. In order to complete the sentence, you have to go on reading. Even if when you read this line, you read it like this: so little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound. You shouldn't stop. Why? Because the poet himself hasn't put any punctuation mark for you in order to stop. So when you read it like this: so little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around. So you have to stop here because we have a comma. This is a very good example of enjambment. So this is a whole one idea here, which is expressed using enjambments, and at the same time the poet is keeping the order of lines, the regular order of line, and also the rhyme scheme here. If you notice, we have the same. Here we have carolings and things, and then we have sound and around. So here our poet seems still very curious. He's very curious to know what makes the bird so happy in order to sing like this. That I could not think there trembled through his happy good night air some blessed hope. And here you notice the word hope is really significant. Hope here is written with capital letter, and I told you we have a lot of such words in this poem. Look at this explanation here. Hardy is careful not to be sentimental about the thrush. Hardy can see no cause for joy. So our poet is still pessimistic along with the end of the poem. He speaks about some kind of hope, but he's not really hopeful. But he can hope that the thrush can see something he himself is unable to perceive. So some blessed hope whereof he knew the bird. And here the word knew is just like the word chose. You can't use them with animals and birds. Whereof he knew and I was unaware. So here the poet is trying to establish a kind of balance. So it is not fully pessimistic poem, but the poet is trying to show some kind of hope that he himself doesn't have or cannot understand, but he feels or thinks that the bird has through its song, through its hopeful song. And here, this is an important note here. It suggests there may be hope. Hope is a virtue in Christianity. So hope is not just a feeling or maybe kind of perspective or a concept. It is a virtue in Christianity. It has some kind of religious meaning. So by the end of the poem, we see that our poet is really still has the same attitude from the beginning. He is slightly hopeful, but he's still pessimistic. He's still desperate, gloomy, and maybe we can ask a question: why would the poet be like this, or what makes the poet so sad? This question is related to the let's say, to the idea of the end of the century that we have in this section here. The end of the century is making the poet is really sad. Why would it make him sad? Because he's thinking of the future. What could happen next, especially after the progress and development and the changes, the great changes that happened to society in the Victorian age, in the because of the Industrial Revolution, because of all these social, economic, political changes that happen in society. What is coming next in future, in the new century? What is the new century has to give to people? Is it something better than the things they had in the previous century, or maybe it is getting even worse? Our poet here is not really hopeful. He doesn't see anything good coming in the future. And being people who are living in this future that he was talking about, maybe we can understand that somehow he was right, because what happened in the 20th century, actually we have a lot of tragedies, wars. We have the First World War and the Second World War. We have many social and economic and psychological crises that appeared. Still, until this moment, we are living in a world which is really turmoiled, that doesn't have peace. So maybe we can feel that the poet is at a certain point is right to be very sad and very pessimistic. So this was the explanation of the Darkling Thrush. If you have any questions, you can ask me at any time. Thank you very much.